The harmonic vocabulary of jazz. Notation. Virtually all forms of popular music use a common system for the notation of chords. This system is not entirely consistent, but it is as good as it needs to be for its purpose. Notational conventions. In the description of the structure of a chord, individual chord tones are sometimes referred to by the interval they make with the root of the chord, and sometimes by the scale degree they occupy. To distinguish between these two usages, we will use two different fonts. When the text refers to intervals above the root, the following font will be used, just normal numbers. When the text refers to degrees of the major scale, the following will be used, with the numbers with the hats over the top. Degrees of the minor scale will be indicated with the appropriate accidentals. For example, the natural form of the minor, also known as the Aeolian mode, would be indicated as 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. Notation. Standard chord notation. In the standard system for the notation of chords, a chord symbol gives the letter name of the root of each desired chord, as well as any further information needed to indicate the correct pitches for the third, fifth, sixth, or seventh, and tensions. Chord symbol notation does not specify the voicing of chords, that is, the actual deployment of the chord tones. Voicing is left to the performer, composer, or arranger. Chord symbols follow this general sequence of components. Standard chord notation. Chord symbols follow the general sequence of components of root, then a third, then a sixth or seventh, then a tension, over a bass note. The bracketed components are optional. Only the root is required. The other elements of the chord symbol are incorporated as necessary to make clear what harmony is intended. The grammatical rules for each component of a chord symbol are as follows. Root. The root of each chord is specified by a capital letter denoting the same pitch class of the root. A pitch class is all the notes that have the same name. For example, all E's, no matter which octave they're in, are in the same pitch class. A single-lettered chord symbol denotes a major chord. For example, all of these chords here are C major chords. They share the same root of that C, but the subsequent tone of the chord are all in different places. Here is what these chords would sound like. The standard system for the notation of chords. Third. If the third of a chord is major, this component is omitted, as we saw with the C major examples in the previous slide. If the third is minor, the chord symbol must contain either a lowercase m or a minus sign. We can see here another 4 examples of A minor chords with the same root but different realizations in the notes above it. Here's what these chords would sound like. symbol gives the letter name of the root sixths or sevenths. Jazz chords almost always have a sixth or seventh above the root. That is, the basic jazz chord consists of 4 different notes: a root, a third, a fifth, and a sixth or seventh. The sixth is always the major sixth. The seventh is the minor seventh unless the major seventh or diminished seventh is explicitly specified. The major seventh is indicated as Maj 7. Thus, for example, C7 denotes the dominant seventh built on C, while C Maj 7 denotes the major seventh built on C. The diminished seventh is indicated as either dim 7 or the symbol with a little circle 7. Here are 4 C major chords that utilize different sixths and sevenths. Have a listen to how they sound. Each desired chord. Tensions. The basic 4-note chords can be extended upwards to include ninths, 11ths, and 13ths. The reason they use these chords is our chords in jazz are built off of thirds. So we went first, thirds, fifths, sevenths. We skip eighths and go to ninths. We skip tenths and go to 11ths. We skip 12ths and go to 13ths. In jazz harmony, chord tones beyond the 6th or 7ths are called tensions. This term, although common, is somewhat misleading. In current jazz practice, almost every chord contains one or more tensions and or one of the alterations described in the future. If a chord is to have tensions, they are generally given a list following the 6th or 7th. The chord symbol C7 flat 9 flat 13, for example, calls for a dominant 7th chord starting on C. So that's a C, E, G, B flat with the flattened 9th, D flat, and a flattened 13th, A flat. Here's what that chord might look like on a page and what it would sound like, as well as any further information. Ninths and 13ths are presumed to be major unless otherwise indicated. 11ths are assumed to be perfect unless otherwise indicated. Indicate the correct pitches for the 3rd, 5th. Alterations. Certain alterations of basic chord types are common. These alterations are most often applied to the fifths of dominant 7ths to give these chords a bit of added interest. These alterations are an augmented fifth, that's the +5, which raises the fifth of a chord based on a major triad, or a flat 5, which lowers the fifth of a chord based on a major or minor triad, depending on what they have given you. Here's an example of G7 flat 5. First you'll hear the G7 flat 5, then you'll hear a G major triad, then a G dominant 7th chord, and then back to that G flat 5. Sixth or seventh and tension. Alterations are indicated in the list following the 6th or 7th. The chord symbol C7, flat 9, flat 5, for example, calls for the dominant 7th chord with a flattened 9th or D flat and a flattened 5th, G flat. Here's what this chord would sound like. Chord symbol notation is not specified. On the other hand, C7 +5 calls for the C dominant 7th chord with an augmented 5th. Here's what that chord would sound like. By the voicing of chords. That is the actual deployment of the bass notes. In standard chord notation, the lowest tone of a chord is assumed to be the root. However, depending on the artist or the style, the actual lowest tone may turn out to be any of the 4 in the basic chord, or occasionally even a tension. When a composer or arranger wants to guarantee that some specific tone will be the lowest, the desired pitch is appended to the chord symbol preceded by a slash. For example, C7/E specifies the first inversion of the C dominant 7th chord, or a C dominant 7th chord with E as the lowest pitch. Here's what that chord would sound like. The chord tone. Voicing is left to the performer. The use of these so-called slash chords is often an indication that the composer or arranger has a specific bass line in mind. The performer should therefore study the chord symbols carefully to see if such a line is implied. In this part of the song, you have an A minor triad that does not actually change. What happens is you have A major over A. It then goes to an A major 7 over G sharp. It then goes to an A7 over G. And then it goes to an A6 over F sharp. A great example of this is the opening of My Funny Valentine. One other thing to mention is that in jazz chord notation, the lowercase m or minus sign for minor refer only to the third of a chord, and maj refers only to the seventh of a chord. The third of a chord is assumed to be major unless an explicit indication of minor is given. The seventh of a chord is assumed to be minor unless an explicit indication of major or diminished is given. The fifth of a chord is assumed to be perfect unless an alteration is specified. Composer or arranger. Basic chord types. The harmonic vocabulary of jazz consists of 7 basic types of chords together with some tension notes and alterations. As in traditional harmony, jazz chords are built up in thirds from a root pitch. However, in jazz, each basic chord consists of 4 different tones. Bare major and minor chords are used sparingly in jazz, but they are common in current pop music. The 7 basic chord types are as follows. Chord symbols follow this general sequence of components. The order in which we are going to introduce these chords will be basically in the order of adding accidentals. So, our first chord has no accidentals and a fifth. That is our major 7th. Here's an example of a C major 7th. Also, an example of a chord without any accidentals is our 6th chord. Here's an example of a C major 6. Notational Conventions. If we take that same 6th chord and flatten the 3rd, or make it a minor triad, we'll get a C minor 6th chord. Here's what it would sound like. Next, we take that same minor triad. Instead of the 6th, we add the dominant 7. Here is a C minor 7 chord. Individual chord tones are sometimes referred to by the interval they make. The next chord we'll look at is the most common type of chord in jazz, and that is the dominant 7. The dominant 7 has the major triad on the bottom, including the flattened or minor seventh on the top. Here's your dominant 7 in C major. Root of the chord, and sometimes by the scale degree they occupy. The 6th chord type we'll look at is the diminished 7th. The diminished 7th has a flattened 3 as a minor chord would. It has a flattened 5 or diminished 5. And it has a double flattened 7th. Here's what a fully diminished 7th would sound like in C major. To distinguish between these two usages,
C, B flat, G flat, B double flat is the same as C, E flat, G flat, A.
the use of accidentals is often haphazard in jazz, and enharmonic spellings abound, as we can see here with this diminished 7th chord. For example, you have a double B flat on the left, and on the right, they've changed that into an A. This is because it is rare to find a double sharp or double flat when then these would be correct as accidentals. In the chord on the right above, for example, the A replaces that double B flat, which would be the correct spelling of the note in other classical practices. We'll use 2 different fonts when the text refers to intervals. The final basic chord type that we have in jazz is the half-diminished 7. You can see that it is very similar to that fully diminished 7, but instead of having that double B flat, it only has that minor 7. Here's what it would sound like. Above the root. These 7 chord types are sufficient to account for all of the distinct harmony functions found in jazz. The following font will be used, just normal numbers. The word diatonic in music is usually intended to mean of the scale. For example, if you're playing in the key of C major and you're using C major scale notes, then you would say that the notes you are using are diatonic. In other words, they do not contain any accidentals outside of the key signature. Here are the basic diatonic jazz chords in C major. When the text refers to degrees of the major scale, the list of diatonic chords in a minor key is considerably longer because of the possibility of using either the natural, harmonic, or melodic minor scales, meaning you could also raise the 6th and 7th scale degrees for our minor chords. So here is a much more exhaustive list of diatonic chords in A or C minor. You will notice there are accidentals, but the accidentals can only occur next to an A or a B in order to fit in with the harmonic and melodic modes of the minor scale. The following will be used. Note that the E flat major 7 augmented 5th is not included in this list, even though it is diatonic. The reason is that in jazz harmony, as presented here, any chord containing an augmented 5th is considered to be an altered chord rather than a basic chord. For a complete list of all the basic jazz chords, please take a look at the sheet that I have attached in the file area called Jazz Chord Dictionary, with the numbers with the hats over the top. We're going to take a little break and talk about shorthand notation, as several shorthand and anomalous chord notations are in common use. Degrees of Sometimes a shorthand notation is used for chords with tensions. For example, C9 denotes a C7 chord with an added major ninth. C13 denotes a C7 chord with an added major 13. C major 9 denotes a C major 7th chord with an added major 9th. And C minor 9 denotes a C minor 7 chord with an added major 9th. The minor scale will be indicated with the appropriate accident. The diminished 7th chord is indicated with the circle symbol or a dim. C circle 7 and C dim 7, for example, both denote the chord C, E flat, G flat, B double flat. This usage does not follow the rules given above, but it is standard practice. For example, in more traditional styles, a half-diminished chord is indicated with the circle from the diminished chord with a slash through it. However, that is not how we notate it in modern jazz. In modern jazz, this half-diminished 7th chord would be denoted as minor 7 flat 5. Natural form of the minor, also known as the Aeolian mode, would be indicated as 1, 2, flat 3, 4, 5, flat 6, flat 7. The harmonic vocabulary of jazz. Notation. Virtually all forms of popular music use a common system for the notation of chords. This system is not the dominant seventh chord with an augmented fifth is sometimes indicated as, for example, C plus 7 or C augmented 7. Notice that the augmented symbol is not beside the 7, it is next to the C. We can see that because it is not superscript, it is at the same place as that C. This notation puts the alteration of the fifth, that plus symbol, before the seventh instead of after. This notation is common and musicians are not confused by it. Now, we're going to discuss tensions or extensions. Here are the tensions generally used with the basic chord types. The tensions are indicated by stemless quarter note heads above the basic chords, which is given in whole notes. It is as good as it needs to be for its purpose. However, before we jump to those tensions, just as a reminder of how we number our chord tones. Along the top, you would have the tones in your scale. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 1 is C, 2 is D, 3 is E, 4 is F, 5 is G, 6 is A, 7 is B, and 8 is back to 1 or C if we're talking about C major. So when we see a 9, that is the same as our 2. When we see an 11, that is the same as our 4. When we see a 13, that's the same as our 6. The first chord type we'll look at and its tensions is the major seventh. The most common tensions to add on to our major seventh are a minor ninth, an augmented 11th, or that is a fourth that has been raised, and a major 13th. Here's what those chords might sound like. When a sixth chord is used, the most common tensions are the minor ninth and the augmented 11th. Very rarely do you see a use of a 13th. When dealing with a minor sixth, similar to the major sixth, we don't include the 13th. However, in this case, the 11th is perfect instead of augmented. Here's what some of those chords might sound like. With minor sevenths, we can utilize all three of the tensions. However, we keep them in their diatonic form, meaning a major ninth, a perfect 11th, or a major 13th. Just as the dominant seventh is the most common type of chord we use in jazz, it is also the most versatile when it comes to extensions. We can use minor, major, augmented ninths, augmented 11ths, and minor or major 13ths. These tensions can be combined and voiced in many different ways to produce a wide variety of colors. The only combinations to be avoided are those that would put together two tensions separated by a half step, such as a minor and major ninth. However, to achieve a particular effect, a composer, performer, or arranger might deliberately use such a combination. The tensions here are strung out on the staff in melody-like fashion simply because there are too many of them to stack up vertically, as in the other examples in this section. This physical arrangement should not be taken to imply that the tensions should be played one after the other in the order shown as a sort of melody. Here's what those tensions might sound like. Diminished seventh and half-diminished seventh chords ordinarily take no tensions. They are only a four-note chord. Now, some general words of advice about tensions. When they are desired, ninths, 11ths, and 13ths should always be indicated in a chord symbol. If you find yourself writing lots of tensions in the chord symbol, you probably have very specific sounds in mind. Because of the inherent vagueness of chord notation, the performer may not be able to infer from the chord symbols exactly the sound you want. In such cases, it's better to simply write out the specific chords you want. Many composers and arrangers provide chord symbols that indicate only the basic chords, for example, no ninths, 11ths, or 13ths, anticipating that pianists and guitarists will add their own favorite tensions. They include specific tensions in a chord symbol only when they occur in the main melody or another prominent part. The purpose of this practice is to allow pianists and guitarists latitude in creating their accompaniment, but to alert them when a particular tension is present in another instrument's part in order to avoid clashing sounds. Many of the musical examples that we may hear will follow this practice. Suspensions. Sus, or sus4, suspends, or withholds, the third of a chord and inserts a fourth above the root. For example, here with G7 sus4, if this were merely a G7 chord, we would want to have a G, a B, a D, and an F. We have that G, we have that F, and we have that D. However, the B has been raised to a C. Have a listen to what this might sound like. Although the suspension originated as a melodic device, the sus tone is treated in jazz as a chord tone. It has no obligation to resolve downward by step, as you heard very briefly in that last audio example at the end. However, the jazz artist may choose to provide such a resolution to achieve a particular music effect. It should be noted that the extensive use of sus4 chords found in the playing of some recent pianists implies a harmonic system based on chords built in fourths rather than thirds. The tones of the G7 sus4 above, for example, could rearrange to form the chord D, G, C, F, a quartal harmony, or based on fourths. Standard chord symbol notation is not well suited to the representation of quartal harmony. When quartal harmony is in fourths, the composer-arranger should probably write out the exact sonorities he or she wants rather than using the sus notation and hoping the performers will get the desired sounds.